this is just for your information, since Luke mentioned this talk comes from a book. This is actually the cover of the book, but there's been one important amendment. In the book cover, you can't see the brain. There's just like bright lights that are actually taken from an EEG scan. But this was the original painting I did for the cover, and the press censored it. And I said, why can't I show this picture on the cover? Is it too dramatic, it's not serious enough, not academic? They said, no, you can't show a woman with a brain. It's a true story. I'm going to talk about consciousness. I'm going to focus, like many do, on vision. So we have this eye. But consciousness is really something that I think should be approached from a broader perspective, looking at different aspects of consciousness, different sense modalities. So in focusing on vision, I don't mean to restrict what I say to vision. So if you are interested in other senses, we can talk about them in discussion. I'm going to give you really only a part of a much longer story. And I think every theory of consciousness really needs two ingredients, two elements. And one of those elements is a theory of what we're conscious of, what kinds of things can enter into experience. So it's widely believed that the vast majority of information processing in the brain is not conscious. And given that, we need to ask, is there something privileged, something special or unique about the kinds of processes that can occur consciously? And I think a theory of consciousness should say something about that. But in addition, a theory of consciousness needs an account of when we become conscious. And the reason for this is the very same information can occur both consciously and unconsciously. So something that's a candidate for consciousness can occur without consciousness. So we want to find the conditions under which it can become conscious. And that's going to be my focus. So I'm going to speak almost entirely about this. But for exposition, it's going to help to say something about the what question. So just to let you know the other part of the story, I think consciousness arises only at a particular stage of information processing. So I think perception is hierarchically organized. I think all consciousness is perceptual. That is, there's no consciousness beyond our perceptual systems. But I think consciousness is even more restricted than that. It arises at a particular stage in our perceptual hierarchies. And here I just build on a view that Ray Jackanoff, the linguist, defended in the 1980s. And he was then looking at things like this, which is David Marr's theory of vision, according to which senses progress from very local features. So just think about your sensory transducers, like the cells in your fingertips or the cells in your retina. Each of these sensory transducers is receiving a discrete bit of information. And the cortical areas that deal with this sensory information, the first cortical sites that get this information in the brain, haven't yet bound it together, haven't yet grouped these things into coherent wholes. So we need to do a subsequent bit of processing that connects the dots, and that's the intermediate stage of processing. And then we need to find some way of tracking invariance. We need to find things that remain constant as the objects in our world, our sensory world, transform in space. We never see the same object from the exact same vantage point, and because of that, the sensory systems need some way of seeing what's constant across those changes in vantage points. So Marr posited a third stage, and Jackanoff simply said consciousness is here. And I think he's right. And I think there's now decades of neuroscientific support for Jackanoff's hypothesis, which I won't review here. But Jackanoff says something else in his early book on this, which is that activity at the intermediate stage of processing is sufficient for consciousness. He implies that all we need for a theory of consciousness is an answer to the what question. What are we conscious of? We're conscious of these viewpoint-specific sensory representations. For those who've come in, there are a couple of seats up here, and if you're acrobatic, there are even some in the middle. So the problem with this claim, and I don't think Jackanoff now endorses it or would endorse it on reflection, is that it's quite clear that mere activity at the mid-level is not sufficient. And that can be shown by a simple and familiar phenomenon, the phenomenon of unconscious perception. And there are various forms of unconscious perception. Sorry for these horrible keynote bells and whistles. So one form of unconscious perception comes using a methodology called backwards masking that's familiar to everyone here, but the basic idea is you see an image for a brief period, maybe 25 milliseconds, followed by something that's just visual noise. And if that happens, you don't experience the first stimulus. You've rendered the little puppy invisible. But if you're given a task afterwards above the threshold of consciousness, the puppy informs your performance on that task. It improves performance. So for instance, the word dog might be briefly flashed, and then you might be asked, did the word that was just flashed refer to an animal or to an artifact? And if you've just seen a puppy, you'll be faster and more accurate at recognizing that this is the name of a dog, of an animal, of a living thing. So this is just a case of semantic priming, but what's important is it's semantic priming in the absence of experience. And in order to get to a semantic representation, you need to process this dog through the entire sensory hierarchy. It has to get at every stage to be recognized as a dog. So that proves that mere activity at any given stage of sensory processing is not itself sufficient. Some people have worried that these kinds of backwards masking paradigms are difficult to interpret because when you have a very fleeting stimulus, a briefly presented stimulus, there's always a possibility that it might be sort of some memory error. Maybe people saw the stimulus, experienced it, but forgot it because it was so quick. So it's helpful to confirm this observation that there can be unconscious processing using cases where there can be sustained blindness to a stimulus that's nevertheless getting processed. So to give one familiar example, Marshall and Halligan years ago did a study with a patient suffering from visual neglect. So if you visual neglect, these two houses would appear something like this. So the left side of objects becomes invisible to you. If you were to try and draw these houses, this is what you would draw. But when asked which house would you rather live in, the patient with neglect expressed a preference for this one, saying it has a better view, it has bigger windows, they can fabulate. That suggests that the fire is getting into the visual system, it's being processed, and it's processed all the way to the point of recognition, even though it never enters consciousness. And this has been confirmed by imaging results, so this is a neural response in an intermediate level visual structure in a person with neglect while they're perceiving something that's going to affect their judgment, but they insist they haven't seen it. They have no conscious experience of it. So this little yellow light module all the worries about what we look at when we look at brain images. This yellow light is sort of a one picture proof of the fact that mid-level processing is not sufficient for experience. This is unconscious mid-level perception. What we need then is an answer to the when question. We need a story about the conditions under which those yellow lights become conscious. A story about when the mid-level enters conscious awareness. And if we go back to this case of neglect, I think we already have our answer. So visual neglect is caused by injuries in basically two areas of the brain. One is inferior parietal sulcus, or inferior parietal structures, and the other is the frontal eye fields. And both of these are associated with the allocation of attention. So you can basically induce a blindness to a region of the visual field if you can lesion the brain in a way that prevents people from attending to that region of the field, and that gets us to the title of the talk. So the basic conjecture that I'm now going to bore you with for the next 40 minutes or so is the claim that consciousness is attention, which is kind of a provocative shorthand for the view that consciousness arises when and only when there is modulation in the sensory pathways caused by attention. Now, if you're interested in teasing out the relationship between conscious and attention, it's useful to think about a kind of combinatoric space where we can imagine every possibility of consciousness and attention, and if you're conducting a research program, you would want to look at each of these cells and see whether you can find evidence for these co-occurrences. Can you find attention existing with consciousness? Can you find consciousness in the absence of attention, and so on? And the outcome, think about this as a kind of checklist. The outcome of your checklist here is going to determine how consciousness and attention are related. If you think that attention is necessary for consciousness, you're going to want to invest your resources here. you're going to want to show that removing attention removes consciousness. So I want to begin with that, that cell. And I'm going to begin this. This is a very famous pickpocket. I don't know if he's a criminal or not, but he's a kind of performance pickpocket. He claims he doesn't do this criminally, but he's very, very good at it. And what you're going to see is him committing an act of pickpocketing. And we'll see how he does it. So if you're ready for this. So he managed to get this guy's watch off. This is actually a reporter for the New Yorker, a journalist, and he really did it. This is not staged. He actually just stole his watch, and he kind of explains how he does it. You're asking if there's sound. There actually is sound, but it's not crucial for this. But I'll tell you what he's going to say in the next slide because he's going to explain how he does it in very consciousness studies friendly terms. What he basically is going to explain is that, let's see if we can get sound this way.
Space around that spotlight is bright hands. So basically I just play the dark around.
Let me just get back.
You've got this spotlight that just moves back and forth. If you think about where the spotlight is, there's a dark space around that spotlight is bright hands. So basically I just play the dark around where your attention moves.
So what Robbins is saying is that there's a spotlight of consciousness, and around that spotlight is darkness, and then he says, that's where I play in the dark. So what is Pickpocket doing? He's distracting us in all kinds of ways that lead to an allocation of attention to regions of space where he is doing something completely innocent. And then where the nefarious activities are taking place, you have no awareness because they're outside of that spotlight, they're in the shadows. So this is a kind of anecdotal or real world example, but it's sort of testifies to this idea that when you're looking at the scene around you, there's certain things you're going to be consciously experiencing, other things you aren't, and this idea that the spotlight of attention determines what you experience is a familiar one. One quick remark on this, since the spotlight metaphor is somewhat fraught. I think it's important to realize, and this will come up later again, consciousness is not all or none, and the spotlight is not necessarily a spotlight of sharp focus surrounded by pitch blackness. We can think about consciousness as more diffuse. Consciousness can be distributed. If you look out at a scene like this, you might actually be distributing attention quite widely, quite profusely, and that's going to be important. But there will be some things that are more attended than others, and maybe some things that are not attended at all. Now, that's anecdote from the real world, the world of thieves, which is my real world anyway. But there are also experimental methods for bringing out this relationship. So there's a huge body of research on a phenomenon called attentional blink. And the basic idea behind the attentional blink is that if you give somebody a rapid series of characters, or numerals, or other images, and have them search for two targets that appear in close succession, they'll experience one target and not the second. So when you're trying to catch two things, the first one captures your attention, and for a brief interval, you're blind to anything else. So I'm going to show you an example of this with a rapid visual display. And your task is simple. You need to just find two letters, an R and a C. Okay? Is everyone ready? Ready? Okay, how many of you saw the R? So very good. How many of you saw the C? Okay, so a few of you. That's pretty much what the numbers look like. So very, very high success rates for the first item. So it's nothing about the speed of these items that's particularly problematic. It's that after the first one is seen, the second one is invisible. If you want to see it again, I'll play it again. And now we'll just look for the C. So it's there, it's not true. And so there are different interpretations of this, but the prevailing one is that basically attention is unavailable for the first couple of items after target number one. And it's been developed into other related paradigms. Sorry for the disturbing imagery here, but this is a phenomenon called the emotional blink. It was first described by a psychologist named Arnell, and Arnell did it with a series of words, and one of the words was orgasm, and after reading the word orgasm, people were just rendered blind. So, who needs the real thing? Just, new kind of morally unproblematic pornography where the word orgasm just appears page after page. Anyway, it's been shown that if you have a item in a list that's very, in a series that's emotionally charged, whether it's a word or a picture, people can be rendered briefly blind after it. So as compared to a neutral image, an image with some violent content or an erotic image can render you blind. In this particular paradigm, the second target is an inverted landscape, a rotated landscape. And you simply need to say whether this series contained a rotated landscape. This should really stand out, but if this was preceded by some really exciting erotica like this, you would end up not seeing the rotated landscape. I mentioned before this phenomenon of backwards masking, and it's very important to come back to it because there really is no paradigm that has been used more extensively for studying unconscious perception than this. And one might wonder, how does this bear on the thesis that consciousness and attention are one and the same? And the answer is that in recent years there's been a new model of how masking works that's made appeal to attention. And this is quite surprising. It's surprising because if you just think about this in a very common sense way, like why should this stimulus make this one invisible? The obvious answer is some sort of erasure. You kind of imagine, okay, this one left this sort of image in your visual system, and this one overwrote that image, it erased it, covered it up. I mean, even the term masking implies this kind of covering. If we were continental philosophers, we could get very excited about the masking of experience, the nature of experience. And I think that's very plausible on the face of it. But if you just take a moment more to think about that, there's something really strange about it. And what's strange about it is, well, if this one got him in the first place, why aren't you just very briefly aware of it? Why does the other one get to prevent it from ever coming into existence in the conscious mind? And the answer is that merely being present in the visual system is not enough. There has to be some temporal delay before it becomes conscious. And why should that be? Why the delay? What's going on in the period between this entering the visual system as a bit of neural activity and becoming conscious, such that a second stimulus should prevent it from occurring? And part of an answer emerged when a group of researchers, including Ensign DeLallo, especially at UBC in Vancouver, discovered a phenomenon called metacontrast masking. And the basic idea is that instead of covering the stimulus with a mask, present a second object that is in the periphery. And if you look at this, so just 4 squares or 4 circles, simple shapes that don't overlap with the puppy at all, if you go by the original sort of common sense explanation, this shouldn't work. It shouldn't mask the dog, but it does. In fact, it's even more effective than this. And the question is why? And the answer that some people, including Ensign DeLallo, have recommended is that this is an intentional effect. That what happens is the dots in the periphery basically drive your attention out to the periphery. So imagine that consciousness arises in a kind of two-stage process. First, there's a visual representation, and then the time delay is the time it takes for attention to set in. But before attention can set in, these distractors appear, and they drive attention out to the periphery. And as a result, no attention is allocated to the center, and the poor puppy disappears. So that's an explanation, and that explanation suggests that attention is needed for consciousness. This has been looked at even more directly by Mack and Rock, Arian Rock and Irving Mack. And they use a paradigm called inattentional blindness. And the basic methodology is to give people a task that consumes attention, like this one, of deciding which of these 2 crosshairs is longer. That's a task all of us can do, but you have to really attend to the stimulus to do it. And while this is going on, they would briefly display another stimulus for about 200 milliseconds. So for those of you who know visual psychophysics, 200 milliseconds is well above the conscious threshold. And in a control condition where you're not performing this task, it's 100% detection rate. Nobody's any trouble seeing the little triangle. And when they flashed it here during the attentional task, they found that many people failed to notice it. And they would give people a series of leading questions, like did you see a shape, did you see something flash, did you see a triangle? People still didn't report it, suggesting that they never experienced this stimulus, and that suggests the removal of attention rendered the stimulus invisible. And again, as with the backwards masking case, some people began to worry, well, maybe this is just a case of inattentional amnesia. Maybe people experience the triangle and forget it. So Steve Most and others got interested in this suggestion, and they tried to argue that it's really unlikely that we forget it. And here's how their evidence goes. So I'm going to animate these little polygons. They're all going to start swirling around the screen. And your job is simply to count how many times the white polygons touch the side of the screen. Okay? It's like a video game. It should be fun. Is everyone ready? So how many times? 3? 3? Anyone have a number higher than 3? 14. Does anyone have a number higher than 14? 16. 15? 16. 16, wow, you're a prodigious counter. I don't know the answer. I'm sorry, you can check later. It's a bit cruel, but I actually have no idea. But did anyone fail to see the red cross? Okay, so a few of you. So when they did this study, the vast majority, about 90%, saw the red cross, but there are always a few who don't. And for the two, I think there were just 2 hands in this room, but for those of you who didn't, I'll just play it again. Oops. And what happens is there's a red cross that moves along the center of the screen, and what's striking is it's there for 5 seconds. And it's a different color, it's a different value, it's a different movement trajectory, it's a different shape. And every major stimulus dimension, it differs from these focal polygons, but it's rendered invisible by the task for some people. When they made the cross gray, or white, or black, basically no one sees it. They can get this near ceiling by just making that cross a little bit more similar to the other objects. So, and in the control condition, it's 100%. So this is like a rare thing to see in a perception task where you can just like drive 100% performance down to 0 with the same stimulus just by task commands. You know, the only thing I can think that's comparable to this is the task commands, close your eyes. You know, it's really the kind of thing that shouldn't happen, but it happens because attention is consumed. This is another one that's been interpreted in a number of different ways. It's a phenomenon called motion-induced blindness. And what's going to happen is I'm going to animate these blue checks, and there's going to be a little fixation point, a blinking green dot here. All I want you to do is look at that fixation point. Okay? So, so what should be happening as you look at the fixation point is some of the yellow dots should start to disappear. You might have a moment where they're all gone. They're there, they're present the whole time. If you don't believe me, just focus on one. So pick any yellow dot and stare at it, attend to it in effect, and it won't disappear. But what happens is when you're foveating here, and just allowing peripheral perception for the yellow dots, the moving pattern captures your attention. That's at least the prevailing interpretation of this. And that capture of attention renders these yellow dots invisible. So all of these kinds of findings together suggest that attention is in fact necessary for consciousness. When attention goes, consciousness disappears. That's why pickpocketing works and it's replicated in the lab. Now, if you really want to bring attention and consciousness together, you might also try and show that attention is sufficient for consciousness. And that means investing here, showing that when attention is present, consciousness is too. And in fact, when Mack and Rock did their inattentional blindness studies, they inadvertently proved this as well. They were trying to prove that attention is necessary for consciousness. They actually proved that it's sufficient too. And the reason for that is they discovered that there are certain stimuli that are always going to be consciously experienced during their paradigm. One stimulus is a person's name. If you present the participant with her own name, she will see it. So you all know the cocktail party effect. You're in a crowded room, you hear your name across the room, and suddenly an inaudible conversation becomes audible. This is a visual analog of that. So we're all terrible narcissists. If your name appears, it's like, did you ever see these people who, like, you pass a cafe that has your name on it, or a shop, and you want to get photographed under the thing that has your name on it? So this is a very exciting thing for most of us. If there's this, like, I grew up when this song "Jesse's Girl" was a hit, so everyone has a song that's named after them, and they have to hear it all their life. Anyway, they found another thing is always visible, and that was a smiley face. They also found the word fire, very emotionally charged words, can be very difficult to remove from consciousness. So basically, the things that matter to us a lot are always going to be conscious to us when they're presented clearly in the center of the visual field. Your own name, a face that has some social significance, emotionally charged stimuli, and the like. So the conclusion from this is that these things capture attention. These are just the sort of things that we know to be lures for attention. You can think about pre-attentive processes as a kind of information processing that's looking for stuff that might matter. And when it's found, attention is allocated, and these things pop into awareness. Okay? So, oh, the sheep disappeared. So how many of you saw the black sheep? Okay, good. How many of you are confident you saw all the white sheep? If you had, if I told you, for instance, there was a deviant white sheep of some kind, would you bet money that there?
No.
Did anyone see anything unusual among the white sheep? Okay, so we're very confident we saw the black sheep. We're not so confident we saw the white sheep. And the reason for that is the black sheep contrasted with its surrounding. And so even if you present it for a longer interval, it's really grabbing your attention. It actually is effortful to not look at the black sheep. It sucks you in. If you visually explore the space in a much more systematic way, you might discover a minor aberration among the sheep. Anyone see the minor aberration? It's really minor, so it's super minor. I don't think you're going to get it, but
3 legs.
yeah. Oh, who said that? Yay, bravo. Okay, so there is a 3-legged sheep there. I was once driving across America, and I was driving through Kansas, which is a horrible state. Sorry, I'm glad we're north of the border. But anyway, there's a place that's called the Prairie Dog Farm. It's just like they torture prairie dogs and other animals there and make people pay to watch this. It's a slight exaggeration, but one of the things they advertise on their billboards is that there's a 5-legged sheep. And so you're driving across this very boring flat state, and you start to see these signs. You are 20 miles from the 5-legged sheep. And I got very, very excited and stopped in there. And I saw it. It turned out to be very disappointing because the leg was just like from a vestigial twin. It wasn't like this one. It was just like this little stick coming out of the back that looked almost like a twig that was suspended from the animal's body. And the animal looked really unhappy, and it was one of the more depressing experiences of my life, which is saying, okay. Anyway, the leg doesn't pop out because it's not a lure for attention. It's quite a subtle feature that is actually almost the opposite because of so-called crowding effects. It's actually quite difficult to even see it because it's actually difficult to attend to. But the thing that's easy to attend to that demands our attention, that becomes conscious. Familiar phenomenon in consciousness studies is interocular suppression or binocular rivalry. Interocular suppression is a version of that. Present one stimulus to the right eye, another stimulus to the left eye, and ask people to report what they see. And what people report is one stimulus or the other. And if the stimuli are equally strong in contrast, they experience the two alternately. There's about a 3-second lag between spontaneous and endogenous switching in these cases. Actually, that's interesting. I didn't need to mention this, but that 3-second lag is quite interesting because it's also the lag time for a phenomenon called inhibition of return. And inhibition of return basically means if you've attended to one thing, it's going to take about 3 seconds before you can easily attend to it again when you're doing a visual search. And so inhibition of return is thought to be an attentional phenomenon, a kind of attentional timer that tells you to re-attend or when you cannot attend. And so this endogenous switching itself suggests that attention may play a role in this phenomenon. Why does the image switch every 3 seconds? That's the automatic time course of an attentional switch when there's no obvious change in the stimulus. But you could also induce this. So if you do things like irrigation of the cochlea, or just have a little flash in one of the two stimuli, anything that attracts attention to one side will render that side visible. And the other side will become invisible. So this kind of binocular rivalry suggests that both attention is sufficient for consciousness, the one you attend to is conscious, and that removal of attention renders things invisible. So another piece of evidence. Anyway, all of these things together suggest a close link between consciousness and attention. Because of this stuff about the intermediate level that I mentioned only in passing without argument, the two elements comprise a theory. So the view has the acronym the AIR theory, and it says that conscious states are attended intermediate level representations. More accurately, conscious states are intermediate level sensory representations that have been modulated by attention. I'm going to say something about what that modulation consists of. In order to unpack this idea, it's not enough to say consciousness comes and goes with attention. We need to say something on what attention is. This turns out to be a matter of considerable controversy. And it's controversial in part because there are so many different experimental paradigms in the literature that use the term attention that many people have come to think there's not a single phenomenon there. Attention is not one thing but many. So for instance, this phenomenon of pop out, like our black sheep, that might be considered an attentional effect. If you visually track an object, so remember when you're moving your eyes around to watch those white polygons at the side of the screen, that's tracking. There's focal attention, so if I present an object and I say, I want you to remember the sheep, and I said focus in on this white sheep and try and see its 3 legs, that was sort of focal attention. There's selection, so if you're presented with 2 objects and you have to select one of them over the other, they might be equally present in your visual field, but you can attend selectively to one and not to the other. Monitoring, so if I tell you something really exciting is going to happen in this space, I just want you to stare at this space and something exciting will happen there, you're now in a state of monitoring. Boom, something happened there. And alertness, that's another kind of attention. Alertness is just a state of the organism. You could be feeling very alert. I slept 3 hours last night, so I'm not. And finally, there's search. So if I say, look in this room and try and find the red things, you'll be able to do that more efficiently than if you just scan the room without any goal. And that suggests that there can be a kind of filter used in sensory processing, and people have described that as attention as well. So this really looks like a kind of mixed bag, a potpourri, and we really want to know what's the common denominator, if any. So if consciousness requires attention, which kind of attention? All of these, some of these, what's going on here? So the view that I have come to believe is that there actually is a common denominator, that all of these different things are just different ways of controlling or allocating the very same resource. So attention is one thing. Attention is one kind of process, but it can be controlled bottom-up in the case of pop-out by the stimulus. It can be controlled top-down in the case of search. It can be allocated in a very sort of expansive way in the case of monitoring, and so on. But what is the common denominator? And it's a standard view. It's not a particularly innovative or controversial view. I try not to be too innovative in this area, just sort of trying to systematize the science. And a standard view about attention is that attention is a kind of gateway. It's a change in processing that allows information to flow forward, to be processed further. And more specifically, attention seems to allow information to get from sensory systems into working memory, into systems that are able to store sensory information for brief intervals and do something with it. So you can think about attention as just what makes the difference between something being available to working memory and not. And there are various ways to show this experimentally. I'm going to show you one old experiment, a variant on this by Roth. So I want you to just look at the red shape and tell me how beautiful it is. So how attractive on a scale of 1 to 10 is this red shape? Just make an aesthetic judgment. 7. So how many say it's 6 or above? How many find this to be an attractive shape? Okay, very few. How many of you say it's 4 or below? Oh, so what worries me is that I think this is really a neutral stimulus. And when you find this kind of sort of tendency towards one end of the distribution for a neutral stimulus, it means there's some extraneous factor that's driving you there. And if it's driving you towards the negativity, you're not having a good time. Okay, anyway, you've all developed a special aesthetic relationship with this stimulus, most of you negative. Test. Which one is the stimulus? Which one is the red one? How many, raise your hand if you're confident where the red one is. Okay, so, so you want to tell us where it is?
On the right side, just in the center. You'll go to the right side.
Oh, my right?
Not to the right.
This one?
Isn't that this one?
The second one. Yeah.
How many will vote for this one? How many vote for this one? I feel your pain. I often feel so alone in the world. Anyway, so we have this situation where we find a high, there's some error, obviously, I regret to report, but there's a high degree of accuracy. Which one is the green one?
Where is the red one?
And that was right, the red one, I think that is the red one.
Yeah.
Did anyone have another vote for the red one? I'm not even sure. But anyway, raise your hand if you're confident which one is the green one. Okay, so a few people are confident. Green one, want to tell us?
Center left.
Center, all this one?
All the way. Yes.
This one, agreed on that? So raise your hand if you think this was the green one. Okay, so a few of you. Raise your hand if you would bet money that this is the green one. 3 of you. Raise your hand if you, which was it, this one? Raise your hand if you would bet money that this is the red one. Okay, so I don't know if this is behavioral economics version of psychology. I didn't know the answers to these questions. Okay, we can look again. Yeah, I think you guys win the prize. You should have bet me. I didn't wager a dollar amount, so you're out of line. But anyway, what does this show? What this shows is that the item that got encoded in memory was the one you were attending to. The aesthetic judgment task forced you to attend, and that got into memory. But even though the green stimulus was presented in the same region of visual space, it's not getting into memory. And that suggests that there's a relationship between attention and memory, such that we might conclude, as I have, that attention is just a change in processing that allows memory access. And this is borne out by imaging results. So if you look at a typical brain scan, an fMRI scan of a brain in a conscious state as opposed to an unconscious state, in various kinds of sensory detection tasks, you find images like this. Basically, when the brain sees something consciously, you see perception. This is an intermediate level swap of the visual system. You see attentional allocation, and you see this is lateral frontal cortex, which is visual working memory. So you see that think of this as the consciousness circuit. It's basically perception, attention, working memory. And these slides get boring after a while. So this was a change detection task. This is a masked presentation of words. And when the word is masked, you see some visual activity, but not much else. When the word is presented for long enough that it's not masked, you see vision, you see attention, you see working memory. In cases of blind sight, there are certain conditions under which a person with a kind of cortical blindness brought on by damage to primary visual cortex is nevertheless conscious of the stimulus. And if you look at the brain under those unusual conditions of consciousness, you again see perception, attention, working memory. So it becomes quite a familiar pattern in the literature. I'm just going to skip this for a moment. And here's our old friend attentional blink. Again, attention, perception, working memory. This is in a condition where people actually succeeded in seeing the second stimulus. So we can pretty much show through imaging result after imaging result that consciousness seems to involve the allocation of attention, and the allocation of attention seems to involve encoding the working memory. So that's some confirmation of the hypothesis. But there's another question that it raises, So I was showing you pictures of the conscious brain, and what you see in those cases is lateral frontal cortex, suggesting that consciousness involves frontal cortex. Or in psychological terms, consciousness requires actual encoding and working memory. And this is something that I actually think we shouldn't assume straight off the bat. And the reason for this is the results are actually ambiguous. They could show that consciousness required encoding and working memory, or they could show that consciousness involves mere availability to working memory, and we would be conscious even if that encoding never arose. In these particular tasks, people are asked to report what they see, working memory is involved, these brain scans are done in the space of seconds, not milliseconds, so it's not terribly surprising we see encoding there, but do you need it? Do you need your frontal cortex in order to experience the world? This is a very tricky question to answer, and I'm not sure we have a set answer on it, but I think there are some reasons to think that we don't. That is to say, I think mere accessibility to working memory is sufficient for consciousness. And let me give you a couple of reasons for that. So one reason has to do with house painting. So suppose you're choosing colors to paint your house, and you decide you really like this one. And then you say, I'm going to paint my house this color, and then you put away the color chip, and you go to the store, and you have to buy a can of that paint. You're going to match your paint at home, maybe. It's really a hard test. You can rule certain ones out, like maybe he's on the periphery, but raise your hand if you're confident which one is the right one. Which one do you think it is?
This one is because I like the color, so I should be perfect for it. 6792.
Yeah,
6792. 6792.
Maybe not.
I think it's not 6792. I think it's a bit darker, so we'll see. It's darker. It's a little tricky. You'll never get it exactly, but I think it might be the viewing angle. I can imagine this conversation with your lover, where you say, but I liked you because of the way you look, but then she complains or he complains, or you've been with this other person, you say, oh, but I thought it was the same one. You were the same one. This confusion of identity can be very convenient. But anyway, what's going on here is basically a demonstration that discrimination of colors is finer grained than recall. Why do I say that? If we had to look at any of these, take the most similar on this chart, and ask ourselves, are they different? So are there any two here, terroirs, any two adjacent color swatches that are exactly the same? It's a little tricky towards the top, but even in the hardest cases, we can actually look closely and we can see that these are different. When two colors are presented side by side, discrimination is possible. We have very, very fine grain, maybe 1 million different colors we can discriminate when presented simultaneously. But when we encode colors in working memory, encode colors for a temporary delay, or for a long delay, we don't seem to retain that level of specificity. If we did, when this test stimulus is presented, we should have a great degree of accuracy matching, and we don't. That suggests that working memory stores visual information of a coarser code, coarser resolution than visual experience. So I think that that's indicative of the fact that working memory is not actually a correlate of conscious experience. It happens to be something that is potentially used when we're conscious, but it need not be used. And I'm going to give you one more demonstration of this. So this is a case of change blindness. And it's the hardest, one of the hardest cases I've seen. At each flash it changes, and then changes back. And so raise your hand when you've seen the change. And I picked this one because it's tough. We have that corner of the room seems to have a kind of visual savantism that is really unexpected. But okay, so anyone else? Yeah. Okay, so a couple of people have seen it. Now I had to look at this for like an hour, and I think I ended up cheating at the end because I got so frustrated with myself. So if you're feeling inadequate, you have the rest of us to commiserate with. What's interesting to me about the hour I spent looking at this display is I got very angry with myself because I felt like a visual. I always thought, oh, I'm a visual person, I'm trained in the arts, and I couldn't do it. So I got systematic. I said, I'm going to beat you. And what I did is I just stared systematically, pixel by pixel, waiting till I found the thing. And I still didn't find it. But what's important about that is as you go through this systematically, it's quite clear that you're conscious of every bit of it. Maybe you can't take it all in at once, but as you move through bit by bit, it does seem like you're having a conscious experience of every part of it. Now, if you can have a conscious experience of something, and you're looking for a change, you're trying to find a change, and then you don't see the change. You have a conscious experience of something, but you cannot recall whether or not it's the same from one moment to the next. That suggests that conscious experience can happen without memory encoding. So you can experience the region where the change is taking place without encoding it in memory. So consciousness does not require memory. Raise your hand now if you've seen it. I might have been blocking it for less, so a few more of you. So it's here, and now it's going to be there forever in your, this is, yeah, it's now like a pop-out stimulus for me. Anyway, what I think all of this shows is that if you have a conscious experience, it does involve availability to working memory. That's what the sort of preponderance of evidence points to. But interestingly, I think the last two considerations, that colors and change blindness, suggest that memory is not actually required. You need to broadcast the memory, but you don't need to receive in memory. So think about consciousness as a broadcaster that's saying, look at me, listen to me, encode me, remember me, but there might not be a receiver there to pick it up. And if this is true, I think it interestingly distinguishes the attention theory from some of the leading theories of consciousness in the literature. So this is only really for insiders. I won't spend any time on it. But there are theories like higher order thought theories, the theory in philosophy called the panic theory that Michael Tai developed, and the theory developed by Bernard Bars and a number of neuroscientists called the global workspace theory, all of which suppose that consciousness requires frontal encoding or actual encoding in working memory. There are also a bunch of theories that say consciousness is entirely in the sort of periphery of the brain, the posterior of the brain, and doesn't require any broadcasting forward. And these include Neij Block in philosophy, various back projection theories that say consciousness involves a kind of different loop between sensory areas, not projection forward, but projection backward. And some theories like Tononi have recently suggested that consciousness is just a matter of the degree of integration of information. And there can be quite a lot of, say, cross-modal integration in the periphery of the brain without any frontal broadcasting. For these theories, that would be sufficient for consciousness. So what I want to say is against these views that say the frontal part of the brain is not involved in consciousness, broadcasting to the front matters. Against these views that say frontal encoding matters, I think they're overstating the role of frontal cortex. So that's just for bookkeeping. I want to say now a few things. I'm going to sort of wrap up in the next 10 minutes. Let me spend a few minutes on a question that's really helped motivate science in this area. So in the 90s, people got very excited about finding the brain structures that underlie consciousness, the brain processes that underlie consciousness. And you might think, okay, we've already just spent 40 minutes doing that because I keep showing these pictures of hotspots in the brain. But those of you who are somewhat skeptical of fMRI results will immediately prick up your ears and say, no, that's ridiculous. That's a giant region of the brain. We don't know what cells are involved. We don't know what they're doing there. So really to find the neural correlate of consciousness, we need to find something at a much finer brain. Now, suppose we want to do that. What are the cellular processes that underlie consciousness? Our problem just got a lot easier because the consciousness is attention formula suggests that the neural correlates of consciousness are just the neural correlates of attention. And that's something that's very intensively investigated. And there's quite a lot of work on this, and there's quite a lot of work that's difficult to interpret. There are different models in the literature, so controversy reigns in this particular domain. So largely by way of reporting, I just want to indicate that I think one model of the neural correlates of attention is particularly plausible. And it's a view I used to be very skeptical of, but I've been persuaded by various lines of evidence, including this, that consciousness involves synchronized neural activity. And if you think about it, just take a minute to remind yourself that attention at the psychological level is a process of information flow. It's what changes processing such that it becomes available to working memory. Well, synchrony is a perfect tool for that. So the nervous system is noisy, each cell is doing its own thing. If they're not coordinated, the chance of propagating forward might drop off to zero. So to see that, let's just take a moment, and I want everyone on the count of 3 to say your favorite number between 1 and 10. Just pick a number between 1 and 10. On the count of 3, just say that number. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
7.
So aside from the people who are, out of starting gate early, it's pretty hard to figure out what anyone said. Maybe you heard the person next to you, so there can be some lateral communication. But me up here in frontal cortex, I didn't get any of that. Okay, now we're going to do this a little bit differently. I want everyone in the front row to say the number 6. Okay, on the count of 3, you'll say 6, but I want everyone else to say the number they just said before. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
6.
Did you hear the 6?
Yes.
Okay, so what we've just shown is that synchrony basically is a great tool for information flow, and that's been borne out. So if you're an animal rights person, I apologize for this slide, but Fries and others performed a study where they put electrodes in the brain of a macaque, and they trained the macaque to 10 to 1 to 2 gradients, horizontal or vertical. And they found intermediate level cells in V4 that were responsive to these 2 orientations. And they simply looked at what the cells were doing when it attended to one or the other. And the basic finding is that the cells synchronize when it's attending. So the attended stimulus gives you synchrony, the unattended stimulus is desynchronized. And one striking thing about this result is not only was there synchrony, the synchrony turned out to be in the same bandwidth. It turned out to be, and you've all heard this hypothesis before, it worked out to be in the gamma range, which is about 30 hertz and higher, 30 hertz to usually about 120 hertz. So if you think about hertz, it's just the number of times these cells turn on and off each second and each minute. And what you get is 40 hertz oscillations correlate with consciousness. And 40 hertz oscillations used to be thought of as a good neural correlate for consciousness, but the theory was debunked. And the reason why it was debunked is it turned out that the defenders of the hypothesis, particularly Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, thought that 40 hertz was the mechanism by which information gets bound together to create coherent wholes. And it was proven demonstrably that that is false. That is just not true. 40 hertz is not the mechanism of binding. And when it was shown that 40 hertz is not the mechanism of binding, everyone abandoned the hypothesis, including its originator. So Christoph Koch, for instance, does not hold the 40 hertz view at all anymore. But the problem is they had the wrong psychological correlate of consciousness. They thought binding was the psychological substrate of conscious experience. It's not. The psychological substrate of conscious experience is attention. And it turns out 40 hertz does correlate with attention, which means it's a good candidate for consciousness. I think there's a lot of stuff one can tell about mechanisms at even lower levels of analysis. In fact, we understand how 40 hertz oscillations are generated at the level of ion channels, but I think I'm going to skip this because I'm very cognizant of time. So sorry about that. I want to show you this slide, though, because it's pretty. So Standa Hahn's group, who don't believe in the attention hypothesis, incidentally, wanted to look at 40 hertz oscillations when you have conscious perception. And what they showed is that if you look at these pink dots are 40 hertz activity. And you're going to see a clock ticking off here corresponding to the onset of a stimulus that's been being consciously perceived. And when the stimulus is presented about 200 milliseconds later, you start to see giant bursts of gamma. And there's some propagation forward too. You start to see activity in frontal cortex. But they're just these giant gamma bursts associated with conscious perception. So even if you're not interested in the attention hypothesis, there is evidence linking consciousness to gamma. The last slide showed evidence linking attention to gamma. The earlier part of the talk showed evidence linking consciousness to attention. And if you put all those pieces together, they make a very neat whole. Okay. I want to speak for 3 more minutes. I'm going to try and end this by the hour. I'm going to skip something about time and space. If you're interested in time and space, we can talk about it. Well, one quick thing on time and space. All your computer screens flicker, but you don't see it. And why don't you see it? Well, they all flicker faster than you can consciously perceive. How fast is that? Well, to get below the conscious perception rate for flickering, you need to be below 25 milliseconds. If you do the math, 25 milliseconds is a gamma beat. So 40 beats in a second, 25 millisecond would be basically inside a gamma beat. So one reason why the threshold of conscious perception may be where it is may have something to do with gamma as well. So the physical structure of the cellular response that gives rise to consciousness may ultimately explain some things about the consciousness's threshold, which would be a beautiful integration of levels. We'd be learning something about what we know about the psychology of perception from the underlying neuroscience of perception. Okay. I've allocated 2 whole minutes to the enemy. So I'm going to talk about objections very, very quickly. And what I want to do here is just alert you to the fact that what I've been telling you is controversial. So while I'm very, very convinced that consciousness and attention align, there are many people who are not convinced. So much so that there's actually a cottage industry of research trying to establish a dissociation between consciousness and attention, in fact, a double dissociation. So let me give you an example of double dissociation work, beginning with the claim that consciousness can occur, that attention can occur without consciousness. So if you don't think attention is sufficient for consciousness, you want to show that there can be cases where we're attending even though we're unconscious. And here's a study that's intended to do that. So this is by Jiang and collaborators, and they used interocular rivalry, where they presented a image in one eye and another image in another, but there was a trick, an added element. One of the stimuli was very, very high in contrast and color, and the other one was very dull or muted. When that happens, people consciously experience this one, and they never experience that one. And there was another trick in their study. The muted image contained a nude. So basically, they got a lot of subjects because they said, come to our lab, we're going to show you naked pictures for an hour. And everyone came, and they volunteered, and then they spent an hour experiencing this. And they said, where are the nudes? And they said, you've been looking at them the whole time. And they said, I didn't experience them. And they said, well, your brain did. Isn't that enough? What the study is designed to show is that even though the nude is invisible, it's going to work to attract attention. So after presenting the unconscious nude, they presented a Gabor patch in the region occupied by the nude. And they found improved performance on orientation detection of the patch if it was in the same location as the nude. That suggests that people have attended to the nude even though they didn't consciously experience the nude. That would be attention without consciousness. And the problem with this study, and all others like it, is that it fails to distinguish between two things that normally come together but can come apart. And the two things are orientation and attention. So think about attention. I define attention as a flow of information inside the nervous system. Once it gets in, where is it going to go? Can it get to frontal cortex or not? That's what attention is. It's a gatekeeper within. Orientation is a change that affects what information gets there in the first place. So the most extreme form of orientation would be changing your body position, moving your head around. But a more important one for visual science is changing your position of gaze. So saccadic eye movements are a major mechanism of orientation change, and even the motor commands that plan for a saccadic eye movement can be thought of as part of this orientation process. So now we have one hypothesis which says, in the case of the nude, you're attending to that invisible nude. And then another hypothesis. And the other hypothesis is you're not attending to it, you're orienting to it. You might not be overtly changing your eye position, your head position, but you're forming at least a motor plan to look in that region of space as soon as you can. And now, boom, the Gabor patch appears, and you have facilitation. Because you've been preparing to look over there, you're very, very quick at detecting the gradient. So perfectly good explanation of the phenomenon, but when we have two explanations, we need a way to decide between them. And one way to decide between them is to point out that there's a lot of evidence that attention couldn't be available in this particular paradigm. For one thing, the neuroimaging studies of this paradigm, which is called interocular suppression, don't show the usual markers of attention. In particular, they don't show an increase in activity that's associated with increased gamma or coordination in the visual processing stream. There's also no gamma. If you look for gamma in the suppressed stream, you won't find it. And finally, most obviously, if attention is what allows availability to work in memory, we could have known straight away without doing any fancy neuroscience that there's no attention in this case, precisely because people cannot report on that nude. That itself is strong, it's, I think, decisive behavioral evidence that they're incapable of attending to the nude. I won't do this because we're out of time, but just to mention it because I think it's the best study in the literature. Bob Kentridge, who's done absolutely the best work trying to show attention in the absence of consciousness, just published a new fabulous study which purports to show object-based attention in the absence of consciousness, which would be quite striking if true. And the main problem with the study is just the one already brought out with the interocular suppression study. I think they're going to be object-based oriented. And because of that, the fact that you can get object-selective processing in the absence of consciousness does not show you have attention in the absence of consciousness. I was going to say something about these old wonderful things, but I won't. I'm going to end, but I want to say one more thing about the other cell, which I haven't mentioned. Okay. If you think consciousness and attention are dissociable, you might try and prove it this way. You might say, okay, I grant that there's no case of attention without consciousness, but maybe there are cases of consciousness without attention. And I'll mention one study that's been put forward by a number of authors in defense of this hypothesis in mental stuff. And the study is by Reddy. This is, Christoph Koch is an author on this study, and this is the study that convinced him, or that he used to demonstrate consciousness and attention come apart. And what they did is they gave people a very attentionally demanding task, a Treisman task, where you have to find the L among the C and T's. So all of us can do this, but it requires a lot of attention. And while people were doing that, they flashed a stimulus, a very brief stimulus, just above the conscious threshold in the corner. And it was the face of a celebrity. And then afterwards, they asked people, using forced choice, to name the celebrity, and they found that people did fine. In fact, they did so well at this that it didn't matter if they were performing this task at all. They were just excellent at this task. And they said, look, we've proven that conscious perception can occur without attention. There are a number of problems with this study methodologically. In fact, when the authors published it, they weren't allowed to title the paper consciousness in the absence of perception. Instead, they had to call it consciousness in the absence of attention. They had to call it the near absence of attention. And the reason for that is, if you look at the study, it's structurally the same as inattentional blindness. It's a dual task study. There's a focal task that consumes attention and a briefly presented stimulus. In fact, their stimulus is presented for 26 milliseconds. Mack and Rock presented theirs for 200. So a reader of this, if you were a referee for this and knew the Mack and Rock work, the right response would be, what the because what's happening here is they're getting basically perfect perception using a methodology that led to inattentional blindness in another lab. What is this? Did Mack and Rock doctor the results? Impossible, because there have been dozens of replications by this point. What's going on is quite simple. Several things. One is that they chose stimuli that pop out. Remember, Mack and Rock had shown that smiley faces pop out, things that are important to us pop out. A familiar face, a highly valued familiar face, is exactly the kind of stimulus that always captures attention, always captures it at ceiling levels in ways that prevent any attenuation through the dual task. So they're actually replicating Mack and Rock's principled exception to the inattentional blindness phenomenon. Another thing is Mack and Rock always brought their subjects into the lab naive. They didn't tell them something would pop out. Why? If they do that, people look for it. People scan the perimeter, they start getting very, very vigilant. So in fact, if you tell them to look for the surprise stimulus, you're instructing them to attend. Your task demands say attend. I'm going to give you something that's going to distract you, but you really should try to attend. What Reddy and colleagues did is they told people that there was going to be a surprise stimulus. In fact, they told them it was going to be a celebrity face. So these participants are really trying hard to find the other stimulus. So it's not a removal of attention task, it's actually a demand for attention task. Incidentally, when they use geometrical shapes like Mack and Rock instead of the celebrity faces, inattentional blindness occurs even with the instructions to attend. So they actually replicated inattentional blindness in some of their other studies, but then weirdly report that in these cases with the faces, it's evidence for consciousness in the absence of attention. Okay, I'll stop there. The basic moral of all of this is there's a huge amount of research correlating consciousness and attention. There's growing and sizable research trying to establish dissociations. I've only given you 2 examples of that research, but I think the examples are actually going to generalize. The studies you find showing attention without consciousness never dissociate orienting and attention, and therefore there's a confound in all of them, and there are principled reasons for thinking that these studies involve orienting and not attending. The studies that purport to show that there can be consciousness in the absence of attention never give participants instructions that prevent them from attention, and they characteristically give instructions that actually advise subjects or motivate subjects to actively attend. So I think if you actually look at the preponderance of evidence, the dissociation work has not been convincing. The linkage between conscious and attention remains secure. We can make our airheads smile, and I will say thank you very much.